Good evening, everyone. This is Ambuj, and I'm happy to bring the next episode of Community Dialogues. Today, we have with us Bharat Ramanan. Bharat had a very interesting journey over the last 2 decades, where he has spent time becoming expert in government relations and geopolitics. I invited Bharat to actually share what he feels connects geopolitics and communication. Interesting part being that the world we live in is so much impacted by the geopolitics and the global policies of different countries, the politics taking shape in different countries and is impacting the businesses. And of course, why do we communication people exist? We communication people exist for businesses. We communication people exist to pave the way forward in enabling leadership, getting the word of the leadership to people, and ensuring that everybody is aligned and the way forward. And geopolitics plays a great role. And today, I've invited Bharat to actually share his thoughts and ideas on a very important subject, which is geopolitics and communication. Why? Because it impacts all of us, even if you don't know whether it impacts all of us or not. So, welcome, Bharat. It's a pleasure to have you here. And before we start, do you want to share something about you and how has the journey been for you?
Thank you, Ambuj. It's really good to see you. I think we probably only met face to face when we were in university. That was a good 20 years ago. God, that I feel makes us feel quite old. But I'm happy, nevertheless, that we've reconnected, albeit for a very different reason. But I'm hopeful that this interaction helps your viewers, no doubt. And it's something that I'm particularly passionate about to try and spread awareness about what I do, but not because it's what I do, but because this is an area that is increasingly important for not just companies, but for countries also. Um, and I'd say to a large degree, even civil society organizations. For me, it's been a bit of a whirlwind journey, starting off as I did as a comms professional as soon as I passed out of university, to then very quickly realizing that my real interest lay in policy, politics, and the intersection of the intersection of policy and politics, really, and how that impacted business. So that was my desire at the time, and somehow I think God has been kind, and I think I've also had the good fortune of meeting good people to help me along in that journey to then finally sort of blossom, if you like, into a geopolitics professional with obviously the added benefits of knowing the art of communication, or I think I do at least. But I'll leave it there, Ambuj. I'd rather not, start. Blowing my own horn. I'll let the conversation speak for itself. But I'm glad that you've had me, and I'm glad to be reconnected again.
Thank you, Bharat. So let's straight away jump into what the matter or the subject of today's conversation is. Friends, we will actually focus on geopolitics, its correlation to the communications domain, and what value it holds for communications professionals. So straight away, Bharat, I think let's start by how do you see the power structures evolving in the world in the coming time? And what are the factors guiding it?
We are living in a world where what used to be is no longer the case. Even 10 years, 15 years ago, the world that we're living in today was unimaginable, right? I think a variety of factors have shaped why we've gotten to where we've gotten. But I think what we might want to talk about a little bit now is the contemporary era, right? Because we've had
Yes.
all of these um, crazy things happening in the last year or so, I would say. And I thought maybe it might be a good idea for me to just give you a quick sense of some of the developments in the world of geopolitics, so to speak. Let me just take you to a quick scene setting exercise here. Look, broadly speaking, I think we're in a world where multiple factors are impacting how governments are interacting with one another, and therefore how societies are reacting to this. Some of these big areas, if you like, and these are the big risks that we track on a day-to-day basis. Firstly, climate, which, as you know, has impacted the world in a major fashion, and it has a huge impact on how companies do business because everything that happens at the COP discussions has an ultimate impact on how companies are expected to then adhere to net zero policies and things of that sort. So that's the first point I'll make. Climate is a huge aspect of this. Um, Conflicts, of course, are ongoing. Russia and NATO, if you like, has been playing out for the past couple of years. The conflict there's no sign of it ending yet, but that conflict has opened up a variety of questions for for governments and businesses. For businesses specifically, how are you supposed to now do business in a country like Russia? Clearly, the answer is no. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago,
Yeah.
if you had businesses in Russia, you could still do business in Russia in the sense that Russia could be, you know, very annoyed with the West, and they could be having all kinds of arguments about various things. There could be sanctions imposed, but there was never a choice that was imposed on or on companies to not do business there. In other words, today companies don't have the freedom to say, well, so what? It's happening. I'll continue to do my business. Today,
Mhm.
companies are being forced to take a position on these conflicts too. Are you on the Russian side? Are you on the Western side? So these kinds
Mhm.
of decisions are huge, right? Because ultimately, if you take a company like BP, which had billions of dollars invested in Russia, when this war erupted, they had to leave. In other words, they've had to now undergo a bill every year. I think right now they have to almost set aside $2 billion in loss, even though they're making profits from elsewhere. $2 billion every year gone simply because they had to pull out of Russia for a certain amount because that money is just gone now. That
Yeah.
decision wasn't taken lightly, but it was also not because they had a choice. They had to pick a side, in other words. So politics is now shaping how businesses are responding, are forcing them also to factor that into their business strategies and policies. US and China, with the big elephant in the room, as we all know, is Mr. Trump coming to power. With Mr.
Mhm.
Trump coming to power, there's been a realignment of sorts, which is ongoing at this point in time, but it's likely to become even more, bizarrely sort of difficult for countries to manage because now we are now in the throes of a full-blown trade war. Now, the US China one is an example of this. Both
Mhm.
these are the largest economies in the world. Both of those countries have the strongest militaries in the world. To some degree, you could say it's no longer a unipolar world. You're now seeing China coming up in opposition to US hegemony. And that relationship right now is on a deeply negative trajectory. That means it's impacting everyone else in the world because of that one, because how much is at stake between these two countries. The Chinese are heavily invested in America, the Americans are heavily invested in China.
Yeah.
Now, when two large economies in an integrated world economy go through this, it's going to have spillover effects on companies and countries.
Totally.
And so companies are already facing it. Today, those tensions are playing out in the fashion of the semiconductor wars, the AI wars, the critical mineral wars, where America is insisting on making sure that it has security of supply for critical minerals. The Chinese are playing games in different parts of the world to make sure that they have those facilities available for them to make policy decisions. So this particular aspect of international relations where the US and China are at loggerheads is clearly a uh, huge impact for businesses to contend with. Emerging markets and debt, because right now, as you're seeing in many countries, let's say sub-Saharan Africa, most of these economies are now in major debt. And
Mhm.
that means those societies are vulnerable. That means you're almost seeing governments coming down as a result of societal dysfunction. Kenya is an example. In the last year alone, we saw the government come down. We saw massive protests. This is spreading in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa because those debts are mushrooming and there's no aid coming in. Mr.
Yeah.
Trump's recent announcement that US aid will now be done away with, which is a major donor agency, that means that more countries are not going to get that money that they desperately need, which means that society is going to be under, well, basically, governments are going to be under more pressure to deliver basic goods to their people. And you are likely to see a lot of tectonic political shifts in those countries too. Then I'd mention something called the democratic decline, or based on the mega election cycle that we had in 2024. 2024 had about 76 odd elections, massive election year. That means with elections come massive political changes. Governments are
Yeah.
changing, people are changing, policies are changing. Companies need to make sure that they're able to stay on top of all of those things. So one of the things that you need to do as a geopolitics professional is to understand what is happening in each of these countries, understand what is happening from a policy standpoint in these countries. The democratic decline is what I refer to as the rise of nationalistic politics in many countries. We're seeing this everywhere in the world, America being a case in point, Europe becoming an increasing case in point, where increasingly authoritarian figures are coming to power. And it's not necessarily keeping with what we were all used to for many, many decades about how democracies worked. Now people are questioning the outcomes of elections too. So democracy is in question. You see that happen in the last election cycle in the US, where Mr. Trump refused to honor the verdict of the American people, although that has changed now considerably. You're seeing questions about these elections popping up in Mozambique, in South Africa, and in many other parts of the world as well. So, is democracy in danger? Many would say it is. Yeah. The last part I would say is also fragmentation and deglobalization. We have lived for the longest time now as members of a globalized world. We're able to
Hmm.
communicate and talk to people because we assume that we are part of this larger global citizenry, which has the freedom to be able to move to work, has the freedom to be able to live and practice their faith in a certain manner. Those questions, those fundamental core beliefs are now coming under pressure. Now you're seeing increasingly countries taking an anti-globalization view, which is to say that we would rather now do business directly with a country bilaterally rather than being part of any multilateral framework. So global trade is a great example. All global trade disputes have been resolved and discussed through multilateral architecture. Now, if you decide to go away from that, now you're only talking in terms of bilateral relationships. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but it's certainly a trend that's increasing. Cyber and AI, I don't need to belabor the point. Artificial intelligence is a massive geopolitical issue now
Yeah.
for governments and companies. Cyber attacks, as you've seen, companies are vulnerable to hacking and things like this. So, corporate espionage is not a new thing, it's just taken a completely different form. And lastly, security. We've seen the rather tragic events happening in Gaza in the last couple of years. You've seen the impact that's had on a company like Starbucks, which
Hmm.
was considered to be pro Israel, and then saw its profits massively dwindling in the US alone and in many parts of the world too. So you're seeing a direct implication of how geopolitics is impacting business. So maybe I'll stop there and give you a moment to reflect on some of these pieces, which we can then discuss in more detail soon.
Right. I think there are many, and I think now this is what we'll discuss over in the podcast as well, because some of them are directly related to. In fact, actually, we would need your insights on how does it convert into insights for communications professionals. How should communications professional kind of get awakened to the need to follow this? So yes, so this podcast, as you said, is about one of the rare conversations very which is real kind of in the industry between connection and geopolitics and communications. So let's build on it further. Coming to the next part, do you think the communication professionals know the correlation between geopolitics functions or function?
So what I'm going to say is probably not going to be liked by a lot of people. My answer would be an absolute no. And this is
Mhm.
uh, not to say that it's not happening in pockets. It is. But is it a mainstream sort of factor in the minds of a communications professional? My suspicion is it's not. And therefore, my assertion that it's probably not the case at this point in time. There's couple of reasons for that. We can get into that in a second. But I think fundamentally, the idea of geopolitics becoming a business risk was never the case until I would say about 10, 15 years ago, when the business of geopolitics and the consulting on geopolitics became an industry of its own in the West. I used to work for Shell, Ambuj, a long time ago. And Shell has what it calls a scenarios team. They actually have people sitting in an office looking at what the world will look like geopolitically 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, because their cycles for investment are that long. So they need to understand what will the world look like. And my guess would be that they very quickly figured out that what we're seeing today in the world may have been predicted by a Shell scenario team 20 years ago. Just imagine
Oh.
that they were able to factor these possibilities into their business strategies a long time ago before it actually happened. So when it happens, the company is now prepared with adequate strategies to deal with those issues. But are communications professionals aware of this? I don't think many are, because it's not necessarily something that's as prominently spoken about, for one thing. And two, in our communication schools, as I mentioned to you earlier before we started speaking,
Hmm. Hmm.
we don't really have a geopolitics component taught to people in the world of communications.
Yes.
So the moment you pass out of school or university, you go into a job, you're immediately in the throes of doing what we always did, right? You were in PR, so you learned how to do media relations, you learned how to work on communication strategies and things like this, bereft of the understanding of some of these global trends that are actually shaping the future of business. Now, I think things are changing where communications professionals are increasingly called upon with that skill
Yes.
set. Now, if you go to a job interview in large companies now, particularly in the West, if you join an oil and gas company or a natural resources company or the pharmaceutical industry, or more importantly, the tech industry, the first question they'll ask you is, do you understand how my business is going to be impacted by politics in a particular geography or what is happening globally? If the answer to that question from your perspective is I don't know, or that I think I know, then you're likely not to be hired for that position, because now they want to have people who not only have core subject knowledge, say in technology, the understanding of technology
Yeah.
and how tech PR works, but then the ability to correlate that to what is happening globally. So if you and I were to have an honest discussion about that in India, in the Indian context, we could possibly say to some degree that, with the exception of a few people, individuals, or maybe a few
Few. Yeah. You can
companies
actually count
again,
them on the fingers.
you probably won't see this widespread. Now, the flip side of that is, if you indeed were to actually think of yourself as somebody who's interested in that, like you are or I am, and we start equipping ourselves with the ability to think more broadly than standard communications paradigms, then we are actually equipping ourselves to become better communications professionals too. Because
Yes.
ultimately, your CEO is asking you to look at, let's say, for example, the Russia Ukraine situation. Let's say your company is operating in Russia and has businesses in America too. Yeah. Now your CEO is going to ask you, how do we now communicate that we are actually, we have interests in both countries, but those interests are not contradictory. If you don't understand what is happening geopolitically in this particular example, you'll be unable to communicate that to your audiences in either geography. So that's I would say a very simple example of it, but it gets more complex as you go along when you start delving into some of the issues we just discussed. So I would say, to some degree, there are people who are aware of it, because it's impossible to not know about it because you're bombarded by it, by social media and everything that's happening in the world. So it's impossible to ignore it. But are you actually paying attention to what is driving those trends and how to understand those trends and make sense of it for your business? That, I think, maybe would be a resounding no at this point.
I have a couple of questions on this. I don't know whether you answered this question from the perspective of a global scenario, or this is in comparison to India and global. So do you see globally also you find people who are unaware to make the correlation between geopolitics and communication or business,
Yeah.
or is it limited to India, or is it globally a problem?
I would say it's kind of dependent on industry.
Hmm.
Um, so the industries that are at most risk of being impacted by geopolitics and political developments are the ones that have had to force themselves to understand it more, bring in people who understand it more, and work in their business teams to help them contend with those issues. Let me give you an example. 40 years ago, in the 70s, we had the oil price shock. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that oil price shock forced companies like Shell or Exxon or BP or the big oil companies of the world to realize that they no longer control the shots when it comes to the demand and supply of oil. That means that the politics in that is impacting the conduct of business in the oil industry was absolutely critical to their bottom line. So that's when they started the scenario teams that I mentioned to you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward now 20 years later, many other industries did not feel the impact of politics so hard on their bottom line in the last 20 years or so. But look at technology today. Today, Facebook and many of these, Meta, for example, or Google, are facing massive lawsuits in Ireland, in the European Union,
Yeah.
because on taxation, on privacy issues, on not being able to regulate social media content on their platforms, and all of these are multi-billion-dollar issues, which
Yeah.
means that it's impacting your bottom line directly. regulatory policy, political developments in other countries today is impacting tech in a manner that's never happened before. So 10 years before, was tech thinking so hard about geopolitics? Maybe not. But are they thinking about it hard now, making sure that they have more of these people in their teams? Absolutely. Pharmaceuticals. 20, 30 years ago, you never had a question about, you always had issues around regulations, but they were very localized. But today, after COVID, everybody recognizes that this is an absolute critical area for to understand how to deal with governments. So now government relations teams are no longer just satisfied with doing meetings with governments and figuring out how to talk about policy. They're talking about how governments are operating. They're talking about in a country, what are the chances that the opposition might come to power? If that
Yeah.
happens, how would policies change?
Yes.
These are the kind of conversations that are happening now increasingly in the West, I would say. Am I able to say the same for India at this point in time? Maybe that would be relevant to Vedanta, maybe to Reliance, some of the big groups. But at the smaller scale, I'm not sure that that awareness is still yet hitting them because maybe right now they don't want to invest in it. So let's go back in when we sort of passed out of university. Clients would be unwilling to pay top dollar for public relations services. We
Yeah.
had to sell what PR was about because it was almost as though we were sort of an appendage that they could say yes or no to depending on what side of the bed they woke up on. But today, it's an absolutely essential part of corporate strategy. It's the same thing with geopolitics, except that today that the implications of not having the skill set are way, way higher. The number one business risk as per a McKinsey report last year, for CEOs, what keeps CEOs awake is
Hmm.
geopolitics. It's not finance, it's not technical issues, it's not domestic policy, it's not regulations, it's geopolitics. So that should give you an answer.
Totally. So thank you so much. I think because one of the very crucial elements or very crucial role that we play in the corporate world or in the business world and as part of the larger teams, business teams, is to work with the CEOs, consult them, and kind of consult them on the messaging, communication. And if you don't understand what is actually ruling the top of their mind, or if we know but we don't understand the subject, then automatically you
Yeah.
don't have the seat at the table. Then you would be kind of put to corner saying that okay, there's a limited thing and you do that only, and that's leave the
Yeah,
business. So
absolutely.
you're right. Now communication professionals are not only supposed to know the messaging and communication, they are supposed to know business, the bottom
Yes.
lines, the profit, the different things that affect the bottom lines, the profits, the challenges which might take away the profits tomorrow as well. In one of the earlier conversations I've had with one of the industry experts was there are only two people in the company who are supposed to think about the entire company. And not only entire company, but everything in the company. One is the CEO and second is the internal comms person,
Mm.
because both are about people and both are about ensuring that people are aligning towards the business. So
Yeah.
and of course internal comms person also deals with the CEOs and leadership. Another related topic that we just explored was internal communication. So how do you think this communication, this geopolitics, impacts the communication domain in the vertical of internal communications and people communication?
As I just mentioned to you, many of these developments that are happening right now are forcing companies to realign their strategies. And the moment you start doing that, you have an absolute imperative to be able to communicate that responsibly to the
Yeah.
audiences that you cater to. In other words, your stakeholders. There was a time when, if you remember, many political events would just go by and people would just get on with it. Today, employees are concerned about doing business in places that are geopolitically risky. For one thing, safety. But the other thing, are those countries considered to be good players in world society? For example, there are a lot of companies that will not do business today in Russia. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I leave my personal views out of it, but
Yeah.
there are employees who will not do work for a mandate that concerns Russia, especially Western companies. So automatically, your company is now starting to have to make decisions that it never had to do before. In a sense, that when you were thinking of brand positioning or messaging or being able to put across a certain viewpoint to a stakeholder, if you did not understand the nuances that were shaping those conversations, which is obviously understanding what is happening geopolitically, then you're it's quite likely that you're going to be blind to what's happening in the world, and you'll just say something which is tone deaf, which is going to
Mhm.
hit your image undoubtedly, but also your bottom line over a period of time. Let's think in terms of a company that's operating in a war zone, right? Uh, to a large extent, companies have understood the need for purpose-driven communications, right? We've spoken about this in the past.
Yes.
Companies, people find that they want to be associated with brands that have purpose attached to them.
Oh, yeah.
But now I think the question is, apart from purpose, uh, where do you stand politically too has become an increasingly important part of it, which is why Starbucks is getting the kind of backlash that it's got because it's perceived to be somewhere backing the Israeli government, and therefore all of the Israeli government's actions in the Gaza Strip, which may not be the case at all. Right? It may be the fact that they actually do not actually support everything that's happening as a result of the politics in that region, but they have now been perceived to be a supporting accomplice. So how do you deal with that? Now, if your communications guy is not looking at this stuff, these drivers, he's never going to factor it into his communication strategy. And he's never going to be able to, therefore, advise the business or the CEO as to what to say responsibly, factoring in some of these issues. So, what I'm essentially trying to say, Ambuj, is that when our old communications paradigms are not willing or are rigid to change, then you actually, as a comms professional, are doing yourself a disservice and your business a disservice because you have to be the one that's opening up the eyes of your CEO to something that's happening in Sierra Leone or something that's happening in Papua New Guinea because you have interest in those countries. But if you're going to be blind to it too because it's chalta hai, but then God save you and the business.
Oh, totally. Totally. I think no. So this
Let me
brings me
just make
another
a quick
another.
point on people's comms, Ambuj,
Hmm.
which you mentioned. I think mobility has been a big issue, right? Because in this part of this globalized world, we've now had the. I mean, I'm a beneficiary of that, right? Because I had the ability to move from India to another country and work here. But mobility is now under threat. Why?
Hmm.
Because immigration policies in many countries are now becoming tighter. Not just America, not just Europe, but even in other parts of the world, where the mobility of labor is not going to be as simple as it used to be. That's a major business issue. That's a major people issue. Because if you're
Yes.
not able to bring in and deploy the people, the right kind of talent, then you're not going to have the right kind of people leading your business in those regions. And that impacts the way you will perform in those regions. So there's a direct implication as well.
So in a way, so what you're saying is that the more the global organization is, the more the internal comms people have to understand the messaging with regards to each market, has to
Absolutely.
proactively create connections between the company and its people so that the chaos outside, people have an understanding that the chaos outside is outside. Inside, we are actually connected in a different way. So sensitization and education of people on a continuous basis, especially if you're a global organization, market to market, and every market might have a customized need, a need for customized communication strategy. So that becomes a crucial factor when it comes to geopolitics and relation to people and culture. Is this what you want to say?
I would say you're absolutely spot on the money. There is no choice. There is no
Right.
choice because you are not going to be able to continue to do business like you used to before without having what you've just said. It's an absolute imperative. So I would not just say this to communicators who are professionals in companies or folks working for other kinds of organizations, but in communication schools, this needs to be driven in that you cannot now operate in a vacuum. Those days are over.
And at the same time, I think it's a responsibility of companies who are in the domain, like agencies and consultancies like ours, like ThoughtCom, to actually
Absolutely.
start training people on the aspects of geo communication, especially if they're consulting or they aspire to become kind of rich in insights and knowledge. So I think
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So it's a
Absolutely. Look, I
responsibility
mean,
on
some
all
of the
of us as well.
large, sure, I mean, some of the large agencies in the world of communications, are very wise to this. They've already started. Some of these guys have their own specialized geopolitical outfits within the large company, where they have a bunch of people working on supporting clients to understand geopolitical trends. So that's a service offering that wasn't there 10 years ago. So now it's there. It's part of the bottom line for those companies too. So absolutely, it is something that is not just for companies who are operating globally, but also consulting firms, who need to understand this to help their clients better too.
So, the one of the until now we have spoken a lot about the global companies and the impact. So, one can actually make the correlation between the geopolitics and global
Yeah,
companies. What are the companies which are local? Like, especially in a place like India, a lot of communication still happens for the Indian companies and maybe
yeah,
Indian companies who are out to the global market, and global
yeah,
companies are coming to India,
yeah, yeah.
but still limited. So, how do you think the companies which are not global, how does it impact them? So how should communication people be aware that it's in their interest, even if they are local, even if they are regional, it's in their interest to actually understand the correlation and act accordingly.
It's an excellent question, and I think it goes straight to the heart of the point that I was making about deglobalization earlier.
Hmm.
We live in a globalized world. There's no doubt about that. Our economies are integrated. There's no doubt about that. So if you're a local company versus a global company, that distinction is now blurred in my mind. Let me explain.
Hmm.
You know the recent developments that have happened in Bangladesh, where
Yeah.
you had a regime change. But in the run up to that regime change, you had a lot of issues that were taking place in the country. And Bangladesh is one of the world's largest exporters of textiles, of garments.
Excellent.
Almost all the big brands of the world source from Bangladesh. You name it, the Louis Vuittons of the world, the Guesses of the world, the Pradas, the material that they need, and many of these are indeed even manufactured in Bangladesh, are linked to global supply chains. So if I'm
Yeah.
sitting in America and I'm looking at what's going on in Bangladesh, I'm thinking, oh dear, what happens to my supply chain? First point. Now, if I'm a Bangladeshi company exporting overseas, and I'm thinking, well, actually, this is a political development, doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm still going to continue exporting to these clients overseas. You have to think twice because now those clients sitting overseas are saying, well, if this is the kind of government that is running that country, where there are labor law violations, where people are being, they're slave, there are anti-slavery laws today in large companies that they have to follow. Now, if labor laws are being flouted openly in a country like Bangladesh to a large company, it immediately puts up the question: Can I afford to do business with this country any longer? Because then
Hmm.
it's a reputational thing, which you will understand, and all communicators will understand that they will be questioned by a larger public. That is the fundamental core of your customer base. Now, tomorrow, if I have a Paris Hilton say to Prada that I'm not going to buy your products, and puts out something on Instagram because I've seen, kids as young as 8 working in your sweatshops in Bangladesh. Well, there you have it. There's going to be an impact from that, right? So it is no longer okay for local companies to assume that they can continue to do business without understanding politics in their own countries. Now, labor laws is just one example. But if you were in Bangladesh looking at everything that's happening right now, politically, etc., and assume that you could do business as per usual, you have to think twice because you have to understand how this is being received elsewhere. So you're
True.
not in a vacuum any longer, is what I'm trying to say. That's a good
True.
example, of course. But the other one
Thank you.
I would say is smaller companies. The reason why I say that line between global and local is being
Hmm.
blurred when it comes to politics is because everybody or all companies today are in a give and take relationship. You are not a
Yeah.
company without having your clients. Your clients are the ones that are giving you your bottom line. Those clients are sitting not necessarily in your country, they're outside your country, right? And everybody is now part of this ecosystem, and that supply chain is long. If there's one issue in any part of that supply chain, you have a direct impact on your bottom line. So local companies, no matter how small or how large, it's a different question whether they have access to the right kind of advice, whether they can afford specialized consultancies to get an understanding of what is happening geopolitically, whether they're able to pay that money to make sure they're able to figure out what to do. That's another question. But are
Hmm.
they actually involved in understanding it? What can they do about it? Can they be educated about it? Is an absolute responsibility of communications professional for those companies as well. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Totally. Thank you so much. I think this one sentence that everybody, almost every company is now becoming of a part of the big supply chain, which has
Yeah,
like multiple, it's like a nervous system who is
yeah,
spreading, that's spreading across in different ways
yeah.
across the world. I think, thank you so much. That's a fantastic. It's like a philosophically, if we say everything is interconnected.
Everything
Uh,
is interconnected. There is, I mean, it's like the body, literally like the body. One thing
yeah,
is hurting you, you're going to have trouble someplace else. I mean,
true.
semiconductor industry in Taiwan,
Oh, yes.
everything that's happening with China and Taiwan is worrying everybody in the world. Now, you can't sit in Taiwan supply chain and just assume that everything is hunky dory, and they're not. They all are very aware, and they're trying to find ways to do this. That's why Apple is moving its production to India. That's why they're
Yeah.
moving it to Vietnam. So, supply chain companies, smaller companies in any part of the world, no one is immune to what's happening. I think the problem was that before many companies assumed that governments will take care of this. Today, companies are also stakeholders in that political
In
equation.
that process, of course. Yeah, totally. And especially when the, in a way, when the power balancing is happening, it's like the scale of power is now
Yeah,
actually, as I said, is not unipolar, is now
yeah,
becoming multipolar. And in multipolar, where the scales will sit and in which direction, and still is still in the formation. So I
yeah,
think, and
absolutely,
everybody has a stake in this formation. So
absolutely,
yeah, and
absolutely.
including us communication professionals. So we should do our bit as well. So yes, I
Yes.
think that was fantastic insight. Now coming on to certain either softer aspects, maybe ethics or maybe
Hmm.
DE&I.
Yeah.
So with the new government coming in US and taking some decisive positions on DE&I, I ask a direct question to you. So how do you think it will impact various organizations' position and take on DE&I? Like the new administration immediately signed up. Okay, you know what? Just put it back into the dustbin in a way. So what do you think is going to happen to this agenda?
So look, I think in different countries you will see different responses to this. And also, I think different companies based depending, for example, what has happened in the US as a result of DNI may impact American companies because obviously they will start looking at how to make sure that they're aligned with the administration's policies on certain of these matters. But also, private sector companies are also answerable to their own stakeholders and shareholders. To a
Mhm.
large degree, many of these things that have taken place in the corporate world have also been driven by shareholder activism and stakeholder desires to see more of an inclusive workplace environment and things like this. So companies will continue to weigh and toss up what makes sense for them in different geographies in different political contexts. I don't think you can have a one size fits all. Because it's happened in America, is it going to be the case that
Mhm.
suddenly in India you will start seeing an impact on D&I policies in a particular company? I don't think that correlation is as direct. I think it is a bit more nuanced than that. It depends on how that company, if for example that company has a subsidiary in America, it might want to rethink some of those policies, not just exclusive to DNI but also other kinds of policies, right? Everything is based on context, location, and of course your own business interests in that particular geography. You can't divorce yourself from that. So undoubtedly what has happened in the US is making companies rethink some of their policies on some of these issues. But does that mean there's going to be a blanket change elsewhere and companies will suddenly need to sort of rehaul everything in every part of the world? I don't think that's quite how it might take place. I think it'll be a bit more nuanced. It'll be based on context, politics, of course, and location to some degree.
Okay. I now ask a question very specific to India because, as you rightly said, every country will have a take on the various policy matters because they are not only answerable to governments, they're also answerable to stakeholders, the shareholders who are associated with them, with a certain of their own ways of looking at the world and situations.
Also, don't
Looking at
forget, Ambuj, if I may just interrupt, the
Mhm.
Trump administration's policies with DNI are pertaining to what it perceives as being gross, gross sort of violations of what it considers to be not very good policy making structures that were instituted by previous governments. It feels that those policies have been violated, misused, things like this. And this is very much restricted to US government alone. It does not have in any way authority to therefore dictate those terms to become part of, some other private company to take on the same measures. But that said, some of these things are also going to be considered by private sector individuals or private sector companies to say that, oh, this has happened. This is how we're going to adapt to it in a particular geography. So I want to make it clear that a government's policies need not necessarily uh, force a company or a private sector entity to operate in the same manner. But what it will certainly do is to make companies look at that particularly very closely, make sure that they're taking the right decisions in a particular geography that only pushes their business interests forward, not impedes them. So if that makes sense, it's a nuance there, because I don't think a one size fits all thing can be applied to these kinds of sensitive issues.
So thank you so much on that, because you said something very interesting, which I just noticed. If we are in geopolitics, we have to have the maturity. All of us have to have the maturity to make a difference between our personal lens and the lens which actually and the different and the ability to actually look at the world from very many different lenses, be it the government, be it the people, be it the society, be it the culture. So to have the ability to detach and then look and still not lose your own moral compass, I think this is a very important quality in that. So thank you for reminding that.
Yes. Yes.
Coming to India, so what do you think, your experience, or how do you, because you have worked in so many organizations, I have also a question related to it uh, for communication professionals, but I right now ask you about uh, relating to the changes that you foresee in the coming years, India's role, the way it is evolving on the geopolitics scale, on the geoeconomic scale as well. What do you think it will? How will it impact the people practices and people related communications in the organizations in the coming time?
So maybe I can illustrate that better with an example.
Mhm.
I alluded earlier to mobility of labor. India uh, has always been a huge resource of highly skilled
Hmm.
labor. Companies the world over, think of Indian sort of human capital. They rate us very highly. That's one of the reasons why many of us are able to move around the world and do, fantastically well for themselves, and they settle down in wherever they wish to. But as I said also, that what is happening in different parts of the world with regard to globalization, this desire to become more insulated, this increasing trend where governments are not willing to cooperate, there's more competition than cooperation in that sense, are going to actually impact the Indian workforce too, right? Because to if, for example, an IT company in India is not going to get its quota of visas to send skilled labor to a particular geography overseas to work for a particular project, it is going to obviously impact that company's bottom line. In other words, it's also not going to be able to hire the best talent. In other words, that workforce is likely to be reduced. In other words, you're looking at unemployment potentially. In other words, it doesn't look very good on the resume of a country that is on its way to becoming a global superpower, which is in our case, India. So if you look at the workforce alone, it's a telling example of how integrated it is into what is happening in different parts of the world. So from that standpoint, a country like India has a lot more to lose if it doesn't sort of factor in some of these trends that are happening. And I'm sure the government is well aware of this. But then for the private sector, it becomes important then to focus on areas like upskilling, focus on how we can adopt technology to basically make sure that we're able to add value to whatever industry at whatever given point in time, that you're ahead of the technological curve at some respects. But obviously that's a challenge, right? Because technology is leapfrogging us in a manner that it's hard to keep up. AI is
Yeah.
an example. Those changes are rapid, so we need to also upskill our workforce in a manner that's in keeping with that technological change, at least if it's not on par, it's at least close on its heels, at least to some degree. So those skill sets will then be valued by the world more. So in many ways, what is happening in different parts of the world is impacting companies in India too, and the Indian growth story to a large degree. That's how I view it. But do I think this is going to put the brakes on the Indian growth story per se? I think that would be kind of short-sighted, because we are a massive country, a massive market with a massive amount of people consuming too. So we're not just an economy that is providing labor to other industries in different parts of the world. We're also a country that's consuming a large number of those products that are being sold in our marketplace. To a large degree, how we perceive ourselves within domestically is how the world will also perceive you. So the way the Indian government is navigating some of these things is most interesting. And plus the fact that we're moving towards or inching towards a $5 trillion economy tells you that there's a lot of confidence in the economic story within India too. And companies that are operating in India are well aware of that, of the buffer that provides in making sure that they're able to plan for a future may, which clearly is very uncertain as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll just add. I'll just request you to kind of correlate it to the people communications now. So what do you think? So let's leave aside currently the policy making part of the geopolitics implications. How about internal comms and employee communications? What kind of communication what kind of messaging you see in the coming time related to people?
So Ambuj, I'm a little unsure as to whether you're asking me to tell you, because of all of these changes, how will organizations need to communicate to their employees? Is that
No.
what you're asking me?
No. So what I'm saying is, so you mentioned something very interesting, and I took away something from there. When you say upskilling, then we have to keep on educate, which means upskilling means in a way entrepreneurial spirit,
Hmm.
the desire to learn more and on your own, not to be pushed, not to be
Yeah.
kind of all the time being pushed. So basically, companies now need to start educating the people in culture, like building a culture which is entrepreneurial, which will not happen in a day. So maybe if you start today, in next 3 4 years, you will have some sprouts, or 2 3 years, some sprouts showing up where people are taking action, people are coming with ideas, people are. So one of the implications which I imagine could be that that the company should start building up an entrepreneurial culture, number one. Number two, the company should the number two is that the leadership aspects means investment in leadership will be very crucial. Not only at the top level but mid level, because these mid level people are going to drive the engine tomorrow,
Yeah.
very soon. So this is how I mean. So in what path that it should start and focusing today, that it start leading and aligning to what you exactly said. India becoming if India is taking the center stage, then how the business do that, and how the business are ready for that.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I think maybe I can answer it in two ways. One is that uh, in the context of that big growth story, that is obviously what most companies are banking their futures on. That growth story will be positive. Uh, the internal piece is about how to make sure that they are also going to benefit the most from that growth story, but
Yeah.
also make sure that they're able to adapt to potential changes that might happen, because growth stories are never a linear line. They can have ups and downs.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in the organization, I think you will start seeing companies focusing more on investing in certain kinds of skills, certain kinds of assets, certain kinds of, should I say, training and learning and development programs, which is not happening perhaps in educational institutions. Companies will be forced to start doing that themselves. Now, large companies, I know, have very advanced learning and development modules when it comes to understanding things like labor policy, when it comes to things like understanding politics, when it comes to things like understanding supply chain, when it comes to things like understanding anti-bribery and corruption. So when you're operating in countries, and in our case in India, if the employee is not going to be upskilled to have knowledge and awareness of all of these various aspects, you will find that that companies are no longer going to be competitive in the same manner. So if one company has a workforce that's highly skilled in these areas compared to another that's not necessarily doing as much, investing in those resources, communicating regularly to your people about these issues, speaking from the CEO right down to the bottom about how these issues are impacting the business, you will find that you will very quickly fade into insignificance, because ultimately business is about reinventing yourself. It's also about
Yeah.
instilling in every employee a feeling of ownership, a feeling of entrepreneurship, as you pointed out earlier. But for that to happen, these are the tactical steps that a company needs to take. Is that happening enough in many Indian companies? I'm sure it is. But is it happening to the degree that we want it to? Perhaps not. But again, that's debatable because I don't know enough about all those Indian companies. But I would only say that these basic requirements have to be the building blocks of a successful company going forward.
Coming to so the preparation for the future. Uh, do you think do you think that companies do have uh, the patience to keep going in certain softer aspects, even if, because it's not going to show, entrepreneurial spirit does not show up on day one.
Yeah,
Entrepreneurial spirit, it's like you said, the growth to path to growth is not straight line. It's going to be like round and round and
yeah.
round, and some chaos, and then again one line coming up and round and round and round, and so that way. So and so do you think and this change is, and because we are seeing the change not only in Indian companies but globally, do you think the companies leaders first of all have the appetite to kind of balance the softer with the demand to show change in the bottom lines now?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes to that. I don't think there's a, I mean, I was at Davos the last time around, and I can tell you that almost every large company that was represented there and their leaders spoke in terms of being able to equip their employees with these soft skills, particularly around areas that we've just discussed. So, to a large degree, many companies and their leaders are seized of these things that need to happen. Now, depending on the industry you're in, depending on the location you're in, depending on the amount of investment it takes, because these are not short
Yes.
term steps, these are long term projects. You need to have a clear plan as to how you're going to do that in these various companies. Now, I know from my experience that a lot of CEOs are passionate about these projects and they want to head in that direction. But then there are also practical considerations to take into account. In a country like India, where the volume-driven businesses are actually the order of the day, it becomes harder to focus on some of these softer things. But when you are thinking in terms of a long-term future, it's inevitable, I think, that more and more companies will head in that direction. And I think also the government of the day plays a big role in supporting this. I do not remember many prime ministers in India's hoary past who have actually spoken about business upskilling, entrepreneurship, ownership in the same manner that the current government has done. I would say very few. Maybe Rajiv Gandhi was one who actually had that vision in terms of technology and what India
Hmm,
needs to
hmm,
do to
hmm.
leapfrog ahead of its current state. That you're seeing now with the current government, and that's an encouraging sign. And that's manifesting itself in policies, of course, which companies can hang on to, use to try and do the same thing internally too. That's what I would say.
Right. Now I ask you a very different question. Uh, and
Go
it
ahead.
kind of, it's a weird question to ask. So
Mm.
from geopolitics to office politics, do you think do you think in some ways there are some basic nuances are the same, or and can one can actually learn from both, or can actually enable the learning in both the places?
Okay, let me give you a confession. I've been doing this geopolitical stuff for now about 22 years, okay? And I'm terrible at office politics,
Hmm,
which is to say that I don't partake in it.
hmm,
And if you are a professional with any amount of experience, you're probably wise not to partake in it, depending on your proclivities as an individual. I'll say that as a point one. But actually, more broadly, when you are looking at how um, countries are interacting with one another, how businesses are having to deal with politics on a day-to-day basis, you also can take back some lessons from that internally, which is to say, how do you present your case internally on a particular issue which might be contentious? How are you able to deal with other people who have multiple other agendas in this competing marketplace? Because ultimately you are part of a workforce, All of us are seeking to move ahead in our careers. We're all competitive by nature. We're also very good at what we do. If those are all a given, ceteris paribus, then what is the difference between me and another guy? That might actually well be your understanding of picking up on trends within your workplace, picking up on how the company's strategy is going. Is there any point in you sort of being happy with your skill set, which in my case is geopolitics and understanding how to make sense of this for the business, without recognizing maybe the business is now investing in areas that that need a greater focus or my attention on that particular thing? Are you ahead of the curve to pick up where the company is heading? If you are, then you'll find yourself automatically at a competitive advantage over some of your peers. I'm not saying that you should. And so also the word politics is always looked at, I think, in a fairly negative
Yes,
light.
yes,
And I think it almost makes it feel that because it's office politics, it's about backbiting, it's about
yes,
putting
yes,
somebody else down, which I think is also a traditional uh, which was what we've all grown up with in India, right? But I think office politics goes beyond that. It's about
yes.
understanding where in the context of the company's strategy and business, how are you contributing to that bottom line in comparison to A, B, and C
Yeah.
people. So that difference is something that you need to understand better yourself. For that, you have to understand where it is you can make a difference. What are your skill sets? How can you improve it? And how can you actually add value? To a large degree, I would say my own success as a professional, to the degree that I've had it, is my understanding of how geopolitics impacts business. Many companies were unaware of these kinds of skill sets that could be applied to their business planning, their contingency planning. And as a result, I was able to carve out, if you like, a little niche for myself as an individual who works on this specifically and has expertise on this particular area. Do you want to call that office politics? I certainly do.
So I come to my next question, Bharat. So how can people become great advisors, especially now looking for communications consulting perspective? How can communications people groom them into great advice on a continuous basis?
I mean, many of the things that I've stated so far are obviously important bits. But if I were to maybe pick out about two or three things that I have tried to adopt in my own career as an advisor to C-suite executives over 20 odd years, I think what I've understood is that the importance for a CEO is a man. I mean, firstly, you know that these guys are extremely busy. The demands on their time
Yes,
are tremendous. Their attention spans, therefore, are also limited. And you need to be able to make the point that you're making so that he pays attention to what it is that you're saying on a particular issue. But
yes,
for that to happen, you need to have the ability to look at an issue and analyze that issue and be able to anticipate what might happen as if that issue were to blow out into something else. So fundamental core skill set there is the ability to analyze, correlate, and bring about an anticipatory response. Now, as a communicator, if you have a particular issue that you're dealing with, you have now figured that this is an issue. It's maybe not out there already, but you have now recognized that it has the potential to become a big issue. And then you're also able to then say that these are the responses we should be ready with. The anticipatory mechanism that a company needs to develop to address something that has not happened is a critical skill set, I would say, that a CEO is looking for in any individual that works with him. Let me repeat that. The anticipatory mechanism to figure out what to do in a situation that has not already happened is something that a CEO or senior leaders are always looking forward. And for a communications professional, that is your competitive advantage. Are you able to look at an issue not in its immediate context, but in a much broader context, within the company's context, and then say, this is what I think will likely happen if we go on this particular path, and then provide recommendations as to what we might do to make sure that our strategy is successful in a particular zone. That's point number one. So, anticipation. Second, I would say is adaptation. Now, we are as I said to you in my first slide, when I showed you all of these geopolitical risks, it seems like an impossible world we're living in. But that is the challenge of a communicator. How do you adapt to stay relevant in the marketplace and make sure that your CEO stays relevant in his peer group and also stay relevant from the standpoint of our relationship with our various stakeholders? if you do not adapt to these situations that are happening elsewhere. So, your ability to understand a situation and adapt what you're saying in particular markets is critical. So, what you say at the United Nations is one thing, what I say in India is quite another, depending on the business you are in. Your job is to be able to adapt that message adequately, tailor it to different audiences, to different locations, geographies, as the case might be. But for that to happen, you need to also be able to understand those underlying triggers and drivers. So the anticipatory and the adaptability come with that understanding, in my view. And the last one I would say is your influence skills, for the lack of a better term. How is Bharat being able to tell Ambuj that having a forward looking geopolitical capability in his company is an absolute must today? It is no longer a good to have, but it's an absolute must for companies that are seeking to become bigger or seeking to grow or seeking to expand into new markets, potentially markets that are geopolitically fragile. How do you influence people to make decisions that you know are good for the company? And that, I think, is something that experience teaches you over time. I don't think there's a school you can go to or a course you can do, but you can certainly focus on a few basic skill sets. For example, the ability to communicate in fewer words than necessary, because I think all of us have a habit of saying a lot, well, when not too much is required to say. So business writing, how quickly can you communicate an idea in short, concise paragraphs? That helps you being able to say what you want to say, because our brain also, right, has the capacity to absorb a lot of information, but it doesn't have the capacity to sort of piece down that information into specific lines that you can communicate. So now the ability for you to process a lot of information is there, but then the ability to then make that information into concise bits of key messages that you want to put to your audiences is something that you need to practice regularly. I think doing that more often makes you a better influencer. I think lastly, keeping in line with what is happening technologically around you. The
Yeah.
world of AI has now dominated my world. My world is a very old school intelligence gathering, understanding what is happening, figuring out who to talk to, understanding how these responses can be calibrated in the future and what the business should therefore do. That's the old model. Today you have AI that has superimposed itself on this group of people who have been taught to think a certain way, because now you're now thinking in terms of a program that can tell you what you're thinking well before you've actually put it down on paper. So a CEO would say, why do I need you when I have this system that's now doing everything instead?
True.
How do you now compete with AI is a challenge that I'm still trying to figure out. Maybe I'll leave it there because I don't have answers to it yet, but it's something that needs to be, maybe it's food for thought for your viewers, but certainly for me, it's something that I need to now pay more attention to. How do you compete with machine learning and AI in an area as sensitive as geopolitics? I'm of the belief, of course, that the human brain can't be replaced, but that may be uh, one point of view. But there may be others who say, well, it absolutely can. Maybe Elon Musk has a view on this. You should ask him. But my view at this point in time is, how do you contend with technological changes to stay relevant in the workplace and stay relevant to being a good advisor to your CEO? I hope that helps.
Oh, superbly. So thank you so much for giving a great food for thought to all of us, which definitely we are many of us, I'm sure, are looking at like you to actually figuring out and kind of preempting how to be prepared and how to not only prepare, but shape and lead and kind of make a place of relevance and prominence per se for as a communications advisor and a communications people. Thank you so much, Bharat. Time just passed by while kind of engaging and communicating and kind of having conversation with you. There are a lot many other questions as I was engaging with you, but we'll park those questions for the next conversation that we have. And yes, thank you so much for agreeing and coming on the podcast. Uh, I'm sure people will take a lot from what we have just discussed.
No, I really appreciate the time you've taken out, and pardon me for the long, winding answer. Sometimes I tend to ramble on, but then I think what I've learned from this conversation is a bunch of things that you've mentioned around. people's communications and culture playing an important role in comms, which is something that I need to pay more attention to, in addition to the point I made about technology. So thank you for having me, and it's been great to reconnect. And I hope your viewers enjoy this, and I wish you well, Ambuj. We'll speak very
Thank you
soon
so
again, I
much.
hope.
Thank you so
Cheers.
much. Until we connect again. Bye bye.
Bye. Take care.